The wind over the high plains carried a lonely kind of song that evening, kind that slipped between the cracked boards of an old cabin and settled into the bones of anyone listening. That song had followed the widow for months, through every empty dawn and every colder night, reminding her how quiet life had become since she lost the man who once filled these walls with laughter. Her name was Lyra, and though she stood strong, folks in nearby towns still whispered that she lived too far out, too close to Apache trails, too close to danger. But Lyra had never cared for those warnings. She was used to carving her days with her own hands, used to splitting wood, hauling water, tending a small field behind her cabin, and mending whatever broke. Hard work had become her only companion, yet she carried it with quiet dignity, like a coat she had learned to live inside. That evening, the sky burned with the last colors of day when she spotted movement far across the ridges. At first she thought it was a trick of the fading light, but then she saw them clearly. Two enormous figures stumbling toward her valley, each step heavy, uneven, as if the earth itself dragged at their boots. Lyra felt her heart skip. She recognized the patterns of their clothing, the wild pride in their posture, even in pain. They were Apache, and not just any Apache. These men were giants, broad-shouldered and strong enough to make most riders think twice before drawing a gun. She should have hid. She should have barred the door and stayed quiet until they passed. That was what a cautious widow living alone would have done, but Lyra had never been the cautious kind. When the taller one collapsed against a fallen log and the other knelt beside him with a look of helpless frustration, she saw something she had not seen in a long time. Not fear, not threat, but suffering. Real, human suffering. And something inside her moved before her mind could resist. She picked up her lantern and walked straight toward them across the field. The uninjured one rose immediately when he saw her. He towered over her, wounds darkening the skin across his arms and chest. Yet he stood strong like a stone carved by river storms. His eyes were sharp, watching her every step, yet there was no hostility, only a deep, searching caution. Lyra lifted her lantern a little higher, letting its warm glow wash over her face. "I'm not here to harm you," she said, voice steady. "You're hurt. Both of you. Come inside before the night turns colder." For a long breath, neither man moved. The injured one tried to rise but winced hard and fell back. A deep gash ran from his shoulder down his side, wrapped in a hasty strip of torn cloth. The other giant looked at her with something like disbelief, as if he couldn't understand why any settler woman would dare come close to them, let alone offer help. He spoke in a low, rough voice, full of gravel and pride. "Why would you help us?" Lyra's answer was simple. "Because you need it." Sometimes truth didn't need more words, with slow care. The uninjured warrior lifted his companion and carried him toward her cabin. Lyra saw how heavy the wounded giant was. His muscles trembled with every step, yet he refused to show weakness. She opened the door and stepped aside, letting them enter into the warm light and scent of burning sage. Inside, the cabin felt suddenly too small for men of their size. The uninjured one's head nearly brushed the rafters, and his broad back filled most of the space. The wounded man, though weaker, still carried the same powerful frame. Lyra fetched water, strips of clean cloth, and a bowl of herbs she had saved for emergencies. They watched her closely, every movement, every breath. Not because they distrusted her, but because they couldn't understand her. Nobody helped Apache warriors. That was the rule carved into every frontier story. Yet here she was, a poor widow with nothing but her tiny cabin and rough hands, tending to them as if they were no different than any other wandering traveler. When she knelt beside the wounded giant, he tried to lift a hand to push her away, but his strength gave out too quickly. Lyra met his eyes with quiet firmness. "Save your strength," she murmured. He let his hand fall. She cleaned the wound carefully, grinding the herbs and pressing them to his side. He didn't flinch, though she could feel his breath tighten. The other warrior stood by the wall, arms crossed, studying her with an intensity that might have frightened another woman. But Lyra wasn't shaken. She had seen enough hardship to recognize the difference between danger and pride. and everything about these men radiated a kind of pride that ran deep, rooted in land, in history, in survival, as the fire crackled behind them. The wounded man's breathing steadied. Lyra's hands, though small against his massive frame, moved with practiced care. When she finished binding the wound, she stood and wiped her hands on a cloth. "He'll need rest," she said. "He lost a lot of blood. But he's strong." The warrior by the wall finally spoke again. "My brother owes you his life." "I didn't do it for a debt," she replied softly. Something shifted in the air then. A small, unspoken understanding. Something uncommon on this frontier, where trust was scarce and suspicion lived in every shadow. Night settled fully outside, wrapping the cabin in darkness. The two Apache giants remained inside, one resting heavily on the cot, the other sitting by the fire with his massive arms resting on his knees. Lyra brewed a pot of broth, the steam rising gently as she poured it into wooden bowls. She handed one to the sitting warrior. His fingers brushed hers for a brief second. Warm, calloused, strong enough to bend iron, but his touch was careful. Almost respectful, he took the bowl with quiet thanks. Hours passed in stillness. The firelight painted warm gold across their features, making their sharp, striking faces look even more powerful than before. Lyra realized how unusual this moment was. A widow, alone in a valley far from any town, sharing her home with two Apache giants. It wasn't something any frontier tale had ever described. Yet she felt no fear, only a strange, steady calm. When the wounded man stirred in his sleep, Lyra leaned over to adjust his blanket. The uninjured warrior watched her again with the same unreadable eyes. But this time, something softer lived behind them. Something unguarded. "You're not afraid of us," he said quietly. "No," she answered. "Should I be?" He looked toward his brother, then back at her. "Most would run." "I've done enough running in my life," she replied. "This place is all I have left. And tonight, you needed help. That's enough reason for me." The warrior lowered his gaze to the fire. Silence stretched between them, deep and warm. Then he spoke words she didn't expect. "You've saved two men who have no reason to trust the world around them." "My people will speak of this." Lyra didn't answer. She simply returned to her chair by the window, staring out into the darkness that wrapped the land. But as the cabin settled into quiet, she heard something. A whisper, faint, like a thought shared between brothers who believed she slept. She couldn't make out every word, but she caught enough to feel a shiver run down her spine. A shared wish, something they both wanted. Something about her. The fire popped softly. The night deepened. And Lyra sat frozen, wondering why the air felt suddenly heavier. Why the quiet between the two giants felt charged with something unspoken. Something she wasn't sure she was ready to understand. And as the wind rattled the cabin door, she realized that saving them might have changed more than their fate. It might have changed hers, but she wouldn't know until morning. The night pressed close against the cabin walls, carrying the same restless wind that had followed Lyra for months. She sat quietly by the window, pretending not to notice the low voices coming from near the fire. The two Apache giants thought she was asleep, but her senses were too alert, too tense. Something in their whispers stirred a mix of unease and curiosity deep in her chest. She didn't know their language well enough to understand every word, but their tone carried weight. Something that felt more personal than a simple thanks for saving a wounded traveler, the taller one. The uninjured warrior spoke with a steady rhythm, low enough that only the flames seemed to hear him. The injured brother shifted on the cot, murmuring replies that faded into the crackle of burning wood. Lyra couldn't understand the meaning. Yet the sound of their voices carried a strange blend of gratitude and something heavier. Like men standing at the edge of a future they hadn't expected. Lyra wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and exhaled slowly. She had lived alone long enough to recognize when life was changing its direction without asking her permission. These men hadn't walked into her valley by chance. Their arrival was part of a larger story she couldn't yet see. A story written far beyond the walls of her small cabin. The flames settled into quieter embers, and the uninjured giant finally lay down on the floor near the hearth. One arm behind his head, his gaze fixed on the ceiling beams. Even resting, he looked like a warrior carved from mountain stone, every line of his body built for survival. Lyra wondered what trail had brought them here, what danger had chased them across the ridges until they stumbled into her valley with wounds deep enough to take any ordinary man. She didn't ask that night. Some questions waited for daylight. When morning finally broke, pale gold leaked through the small window. Lyra's eyes opened the moment the first rooster crowed from somewhere beyond the hills. She stretched the stiffness from her arms and glanced across the room. The uninjured warrior was already awake, sitting with his back straight, hands resting on his knees. His brother slept more peacefully now, his breathing strong and steady. "Good morning," Lyra said quietly as she stood. The warrior nodded once. "Your fire kept him alive. You both would have frozen out there." She stepped closer, checking the bandage she'd wrapped the night before. The herbs had done their work. The bleeding had stopped. "He needs a few days of rest." The warrior studied her face with a look she couldn't decipher. "You have courage," he said. "Most settlers fear us." "I've lived far from towns for years," she replied. "Fear doesn't fix wounds." He tilted his head slightly. "What does fix wounds?" "Steady hands," she answered, "and a little kindness." A shadow passed through his gaze, something deep-rooted. He didn't respond. But she sensed he was weighing her words as though they carried meaning far beyond. This small cabin. She went outside to fetch water from the old well behind the house. The morning air was crisp enough to sting her cheeks, and the scent of juniper drifted from the hillside. She filled the bucket, hearing the wood creak under her steps. And when she returned inside, the warrior had moved to check his brother's bandages with surprising gentleness for a man his size. Lyra poured water into a kettle. "I never asked your names," she said. The uninjured warrior hesitated before speaking, as if deciding how much to reveal. "I am Tacoma," he said. "My brother is Eric." Their names settled in the room like sparks finding dry grass, powerful and ancient. "Tacoma," she repeated softly. Strong name. He didn't smile, but something softened around his eyes. Eric stirred awake then, his voice rough. "Where are we?" "In my home," Lyra said. "You collapsed near my field. You were badly hurt." Eric tried to sit, grimacing at the sharp pull of pain, and Tacoma steadied him with one hand. Lyra moved closer quickly, supporting Eric's back while keeping her touch careful and respectful. "You saved us," Eric said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. Not suspiciously, but as if trying to understand why. "You needed help?" she answered simply. "That's all." Eric exchanged a glance with Tacoma, and in that glance lived a quiet conversation she couldn't hear. Lyra prepared a simple breakfast: cornbread, dried berries softened in hot water, and a small pot of stew left from the night before. She set the bowls on the table, stepping aside in case the brothers preferred to eat privately. But Tacoma gestured for her to sit. "You share your home," he said. "Share your table too." Lyra hesitated before joining them. She wasn't used to company anymore, especially not company as imposing as these two warriors. Yet something about their presence didn't feel threatening. If anything, the cabin felt steadier with them inside it, like the walls themselves trusted their strength. As they ate, Lyra learned small bits of their story. Not everything. They spoke carefully, choosing what details to offer. But she gathered enough to understand that something had gone terribly wrong. Eric had been wounded during a confrontation near their territory. Not with settlers. Not with soldiers. With another Apache band? Your own people? Lyra asked gently. Tacoma's jaw tightened. Not all Apache walk the same path. Arak lowered his gaze. Some choose anger, old grudges. They believe strength is proved by conflict, and you too. Lyra asked. Tacoma answered first. We walk another path. Arik's voice carried quiet sorrow. We tried to stop the fighting, Lyra nodded slowly. This land had seen too much violence already between settlers and Apache, between soldiers and tribes, and even within families torn apart by the changing world. She understood the weight of trying to protect peace. Her late husband had once tried the same, and it had cost him his life. She didn't tell them that part. Not yet. Tacoma looked around her small cabin, taking in the old tools, the mended curtains, the simple furniture she had crafted or salvaged herself. "You live far from the towns," he said. "Why?" Lyra stirred the last of her stew. "My husband died in a wagon accident 2 winters ago. After he passed, the townsfolk treated me like a burden. Whispered behind my back. Wondered how long before I remarried, as if I were just waiting to be claimed." She looked at the fire instead of at them. "So I came here. Quiet suits me." Tacoma watched her with a gaze that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. Arik seemed to study her more gently now, as if understanding her solitude. "Living alone is hard," Arik said softly. "It is," she admitted. "But I manage." Tacoma's voice held something new, something she couldn't quite name. "You manage with strength, eh?" The compliment caught her off guard. She looked away, pretending to tidy the table. Compliments from men like them, strong, powerful, carved from earth and fire, felt different than anything she had known. As the day stretched on, as the brothers helped where they could, Arik's movements were slow but determined. He insisted on stepping outside to breathe fresh air, leaning heavily on Tacoma's arm. Tacoma carried wood from the shed to the porch, each log balanced on one powerful shoulder. Lyra watched him from the doorway, no longer trying to hide her curiosity. His strength didn't surprise her, but the quiet way he worked did. He moved with purpose, not pride. As if helping her was not an obligation, but a choice he respected. Later in the afternoon, Lyra found Tacoma repairing her broken fence without being asked. His hands moved skillfully, tightening ropes, straightening posts, making the barrier sturdier than it had been in years. "You don't have to do that," she said. Tacoma didn't look up. "You helped us. We help you." The simplicity of his answer warmed something deep inside her. She stepped closer, standing beside him as he tied the final knot. "You and Arik. You carry more than wounds," she said gently. "Something weighs on both of you." Tacoma paused, his expression unreadable. For a moment she thought he wouldn't reply. Then he turned toward the valley, eyes fixed on the distant ridges. "There is a storm coming," he said quietly, "but not the kind you see in the sky." Lyra felt a shiver coil down her spine. "You mean danger?" Tacoma nodded once. "Our enemies may come searching. They know we live. Will they come here?" His silence was answer enough. Lyra's breath trembled as she looked toward her cabin. Her small, quiet life, her safe place, was slipping into the shadow of something larger than she ever imagined. Tacoma.
I finally looked at her again.
And in his eyes lived both warning and promise. "We will not let harm come to you." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they tangled with the memory of their whispered conversation from last night. A shared wish. Something unspoken. Something she wasn't sure she understood as the sun dropped behind the ridges. The brothers returned inside, and Lyra closed the door against the rising wind. But the question gnawed at her long after darkness filled the cabin. What storm were they truly bringing into her life? And what exactly was the wish whispered between them that night she saved their lives? The wind carried a sharper bite that evening, colder than the night before, as if the land itself sensed something approaching. Lyra felt it in the pit of her stomach while she stirred a pot of stew over the fire. Tacoma and Arik had spent most of the day helping her around the cabin. But as sunset crept in, a heavy silence settled over the three of them. Even the birds had gone quiet. Something in the air felt tight, stretched thin, like the world was holding its breath. Arik sat near the hearth, his injured side still bound with herbs and cloth, but his strength was returning. He watched the flames carefully, his eyes drifting every now and then toward the door, as if listening for footsteps hidden in the wind. Tacoma stood by the window, arms crossed, his powerful frame casting a long shadow across the floor. He had hardly spoken since dusk, and when he did, his words felt measured. "Chosen one by one. There are tracks near the ridge," Tacoma had said earlier. "Fresh ones." Lyra had felt a shiver then. "Human. Too many for a stray hunter," Arik added. "Not settlers either." Now as night took the valley, the danger felt closer. The brothers knew something she didn't. She could see it in the way Tacoma's shoulders tightened, in the way Arik's breathing deepened whenever he heard distant rustling. The land around her cabin, had always been quiet, peaceful, but peace broke easily on the frontier. Lyra ladled stew into 3 bowls and set them on the table. Arik tried to stand without help, though he grunted softly, gripping the chair for support. Tacoma turned from the window and took his seat without looking away from the dark outside. Lyra sat last, though her appetite was gone. "What exactly happened between you and the other band?" she asked gently. Tacoma didn't answer right away. He rubbed a hand along the edge of the wooden table, as if deciding how much truth to offer. Arik exhaled slowly. "We tried to stop a raid. Not on settlers. On another tribe? Old rivalries. Young warriors wanting to prove themselves. They didn't like that we stood in their way." Tacoma's voice was lower. "They wanted war. We refused to give it." Lyra set down her spoon. "And they hurt you for it?" Arik nodded. "They saw us as traitors." A heavy quiet followed. Lyra's chest tightened with sympathy, but more than that, she felt a surge of anger on their behalf. It was unfair men trying to stop violence punished by those who embraced it. She knew that crossroads too well. Her husband had once stood between 2 feuding groups of settlers, trying to keep the peace. He hadn't survived the night. "You did the right thing," she said softly. Tacoma finally looked at her, his eyes meeting hers with a steady intensity. "Right does not always keep us alive." The words sank deep. Lyra reached for the kettle and poured hot water into their cups, hands trembling just enough for Tacoma to notice. His gaze softened, the tension in his jaw easing for the first time that evening. "You helped us without fear," he said. "We will keep that kindness safe." Lyra didn't know how to respond, so she focused on cleaning the table. But inside, her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She was used to solitude, used to danger too, but having to Apache warriors speak to her with that quiet loyalty stirred feelings. She didn't fully understand. While she washed the bowls, Arik limped outside for air, Tacoma stepping behind him to ensure he didn't strain himself. The brothers stood on the porch, their silhouettes framed by moonlight. Lyra dried her hands and watched from the doorway, letting their voices drift back to her. "We cannot stay long," Arik murmured. "We can't leave her alone," Tacoma replied. "Not with them searching." Arik leaned on the railing. "She is not our responsibility, yet she became at the moment she saved your life," Tacoma said firmly. Lyra's breath caught. She knew she shouldn't be eavesdropping, but every word wrapped itself around her heart. She closed the door quietly and stepped back into the warmth of the cabin. The warmth couldn't melt the worry crawling through her. After a few moments, the door opened and Tacoma stepped inside, alone. Arik remained outside, watching the dark hills. "We need to talk," Tacoma said. Lyra nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Tell me what I should know." Tacoma approached the table and placed both hands on the surface, leaning slightly as if grounding himself. "The men who attacked us. They are close. Closer than I wanted to admit. They will not stop searching until they find us. And if they see your cabin, they will wonder why we came here." Lyra felt her pulse quicken. "What will they do if they find you here?" Tacoma's jaw tightened again. "They might try to draw us out by threatening what we care about." Lyra stared at him. "And what do you care about here?" Tacoma lifted his gaze and held hers, unblinking. "You." The word struck so sharply she forgot to breathe. For a moment she didn't know if he meant her safety, her kindness, or something deeper. But his eyes didn't waver. They held a truth that felt heavier than danger. Before she could respond, Ara came back inside. "We shouldn't stay in the open. Someone could be watching from the ridge." Tacoma nodded. "We stay close. No one sleeps deeply tonight." Lyra gathered blankets for them, but the warriors refused to rest on the floor as before. Instead, they stayed near the door and windows, keeping watch like silent guardians. Arik sat with a spear he had fashioned earlier from a broken fence post, while Tacoma sharpened a stone blade with steady, practiced motions. Lyra tried to rest on her bed, but sleep never came. Her mind raced with questions. Who were these men hunting the brothers? How many were there? Would they come tonight? Or tomorrow? And what would they do if they found her alone with 2 warriors they considered traitors? She rose quietly and stepped toward the fire. Tacoma looked at her without lifting his head, as if sensing her movement. You should rest, said. I can't, she whispered. Not with danger coming. Tacoma set down the blade. Danger finds everyone. But fear is what breaks us first. Lyra sank into the chair near him. I'm not afraid of you, she said, but I'm afraid of losing this place. Tacoma's expression softened again. This land has strength. You have strength. What tries to harm you will face more than just two men. She didn't know if he meant his brother and himself or something bigger, something spiritual, something rooted in the earth beneath their feet. Eric shifted from his spot near the door. They don't know you, he said, but they will soon. Lyra frowned. What do you mean? Tacoma exchanged a quick glance with Arik. Our enemies believe we carry something valuable, he said carefully. Something they want. Lyra straightened. What is it? Tacoma hesitated, then answered with quiet certainty. Knowledge, influence, and something they fear losing, Arik added. They think we will unite others against them. They believe strength comes from fear. We know strength comes from unity. Lyra tried to understand the deeper meaning in their words. It wasn't just a tribal conflict. It was something larger, split between people who wanted peace and those who fed on power. So they want to silence you, she said. Tacoma nodded. Or break us. And if you're with me, Lyra murmured, they might try to break me too. A heavy silence followed. You didn't ask for this, Arik said. We brought danger to your home. Lyra looked at him with steady resolve. You brought honesty too. And I'd rather face danger with honest men than live safely among liars. The brothers exchanged another look, but this time their expression held something like respect. Or gratitude. Or both. Outside, the wind grew harsher, rattling the shutters. Lyra felt the tension coil through the cabin like a tightening rope. Tacoma stood and walked toward the window again, his posture alert. They will come, he murmured. Maybe not tonight, but soon. Arik gripped his spear, and we will face them. Lyra stepped closer, her heart beat loud in her ears. All three of us. Tacoma turned to her slowly. You are brave, she said. Just tired of losing everything. Arik gave a rare, faint smile. Then we stand together. The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. The cabin felt smaller now, not from fear, but from the weight of what lay ahead. Lyra didn't know what the next hours or days would bring, but she knew one thing with certainty. The storm Tacoma warned of was no longer a distant threat. It was here, circling the valley in the dark, waiting for its moment to strike. And when it came, the three of them would face it together, whether they were ready or not. The night stretched long and restless as Lyra sat awake beside the dimming fire, listening to every creak of the cabin walls. Tacoma and Arik kept their silent watch near the door and window, their shadows shifting like sentinels carved from old stone. The danger circling the valley felt closer now, so close she imagined she could feel its breath against the windows. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to convince her heart not to race every time the branches outside tapped against the siding. But fear had its own rhythm. It drummed in her chest no matter how tightly she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, just before dawn. Tacoma crossed the room and knelt beside her. His voice was low, calm, but firm enough to cut through the thick worry that clouded her thoughts. You need rest, he said. Your strength matters now. Lyra shook her head. I can't sleep knowing what's out there. Tacoma's eyes softened. You fear the storm. That means you are wise. But storms drain the tired first. She let out a slow breath, her eyelids heavy despite the tension inside her. If I close my eyes, promise you'll wake me if anything changes. Tacoma nodded once. I promise. She finally lay down, exhaustion tugging her into a shallow sleep. But she woke before the sun fully rose, jolting upright at the sound of voices outside. Not close, not yet. But distant, echoing, real. Tacoma was already at the door, spear in hand. Arik stood with him, leaning carefully on his stronger leg, pain etched across his face, but determination stronger still. Lyra joined them, fear tightening her throat as she listened. The voices were too numerous to count, drifting faintly from beyond the ridge. It sounded like a group moving with purpose, not aimless wanderers. "They're scouting," Tacoma murmured. "Trying to see if the trail leads here." Arak's jaw tightened. "They know we're near. It won't take them long." Lyra gripped the edge of the doorframe. "Is there anywhere we can hide?" "No," Tacoma said. "They know this land as we do. But we can prepare." Tacoma led them around the property as the sun rose higher, and marking spots where visibility was low and paths enemies might use. He and Arak strengthened the fence and moved brush to create barriers. They stacked stones near the cabin for defense, and they placed warning markers, small but meaningful signs only the brothers could interpret around the perimeter. Lyra followed their instructions, helping where she could. Her hands trembled while she carried stones to Tacoma. Sweat mixed with dust across her forehead. She had worked this land for years, but never for a reason like this. Now every movement felt like part of a battle she hadn't asked for, yet couldn't walk away from. By midday, the tension in the air tightened until she felt it almost pressing against her skin. The valley was too quiet, unnaturally so. Even the birds avoided the open sky. Lyra stepped into the cabin, trying to catch her breath. She noticed something new, fresh tracks by the back of the house. Tracks she hadn't seen that morning. Her pulse spiked. She called for Tacoma and Arak. Tacoma knelt beside the tracks, his eyes narrowing. One man, alone, watching. Arak leaned heavily on a post. "A scout." Lyra's voice shook. "Did he see us?" Tacoma didn't answer right away. He traced the edge of the track with his fingers, studying the direction it pointed. "He came close," he said finally. "Too close." Arak's expression darkened. "They know we're here." Tacoma rose slowly, his face set with a calm that unsettled her more than fear would have. "Tonight will be the turning point." Lyra swallowed hard. "What do we do until then?" "We stay inside," Tacoma said. "We stay alert, and we stay together." They returned to the cabin, bolting the door and shuttering the windows. The air inside felt thick, charged, as if the walls themselves sensed the coming conflict. The brothers took positions near the door and window again, their movements deliberate. They checked their weapons. They shared brief, quiet words Lyra couldn't understand. But she could feel the weight of them. She tried to distract herself by tending the fire and preparing food, though none of them seemed hungry. When she looked up, Tacoma's eyes were on her, not with fear, not with doubt, but with something heavy and unspoken. Something that made her chest ache in a way she wasn't ready to name. "You didn't have to help us," Tacoma said. Lyra stared at him. "I couldn't leave you to die. You risked your life, your home, everything you have." His voice held a depth she hadn't heard before. She stepped closer. "What kind of person would I be if I turned away from someone in need?" Tacoma lowered his gaze briefly, then met her eyes again. "The kind who lives longer." She almost smiled but couldn't, not with danger pressing closer by the minute. Arak watched them quietly. "You changed our path," he murmured. "You changed more than you know." Lyra didn't ask what that meant. Every time she tried to understand the brothers' hidden words, she felt the mystery deepen. She could sense threads tying their fates together now. Threads woven by choices none of them had expected to make. As evening crept in, the wind picked up again, carrying with it a faint smell of smoke from somewhere far away. Lyra paced the cabin, unable to sit still. Tacoma finally stepped toward her and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Breathe," he said softly. She nodded, though her heartbeat didn't slow. "How can you stay so calm?" Tacoma looked toward the door, his profile hard and resolute. "We survived because we learned to breathe through fear," Arak added. "Fear sharpens us, but panic destroys us." Lyra tried to take their wisdom to heart. She inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, but each breath felt fragile, as if it might break apart under the weight of the growing threat. Night descended fast, the sky turning dark before she realized how late it had become. They extinguished the lamps, leaving only the faintest glow of the dying fire. The world outside was pitch black. Every sound seemed amplified, the groan of wood, the hiss of the wind, the distant chirp of crickets. Then the crickets stopped. All at once, Lyra froze. Tacoma lifted a hand, signaling silence. Arik gripped his spear, his posture rigid. No one dared breathe too loudly. Footsteps, soft at first. Then more. Coming from the ridge? Coming closer. Lyra's stomach dropped. She reached instinctively for the table, bracing herself. Tacoma whispered, "They're here." The words were barely audible, but they struck like lightning. The footsteps multiplied. The sound of voices carried through the dark. Low, intentional. A group preparing to surround a cabin. Lyra's pulse hammered in her ears as she looked from Tacoma to Arik. She saw fear in neither of their faces, only readiness. Tacoma positioned himself at the door, hands steady on his weapon. Arik moved to the window, every muscle taut despite the wound pulling at his side. Lyra whispered shakily, "What if they try to burn the house?" "They want us alive," Tacoma said. "For now." The words sent a tremor down her spine. Shadows moved outside. She could see them through gaps in the shutters. Several figures, maybe more. One stepped closer, inspecting the ground near the porch, then signaling to others. More shadows gathered. More shapes. Surrounding them, Lyra's throat tightened. "What do they want?" Arik exhaled sharply. "They want to break us. To make an example, they will use whatever they can," Tacoma added. "Fear, threats." Lyra felt her breath catch. "Including me." Tacoma turned to her with fierce certainty. "They will not touch you." The footsteps stopped. Silence fell cold and heavy. Then a deep voice called out from the darkness. A voice dripping with authority and something darker. "Tacoma, come out." Lyra's heart slammed against her ribs. Tacoma stood tall, unflinching. "We're not going anywhere." The shadow outside chuckled, a cruel sound. "You are wounded, weak, and hiding with a settler woman. Strange company for men who claim honor." Arik snarled under his breath. Lyra's fear sharpened into anger. The voice grew louder. "Bring her out. She will speak for you." Lyra's breath hitched. Tacoma stepped in front of her, blocking her completely. "No." The shadow moved closer. "Then we take her." Lyra felt the room tilt. Tacoma's hand tightened on his weapon. Arik shifted his stance, ready to spite his wound. Outside, torches flared to life. Flames lit the valley with a harsh glow. The men surrounding the cabin stepped forward, forming a ring of fire around the little home. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit. The storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and the next moment would decide everything. The flames outside crackled and twisted, throwing long streaks of orange light across the cabin walls. Lyra stood behind Tacoma, her breath caught somewhere deep inside her chest, as if fear had tied a knot around it. The ring of fire burned brighter, and shadows of armed men stretched across the yard, circling the small home like wolves, closing in on a wounded deer. Yet inside the cabin, a different strength gathered, one formed not of numbers, but of determination. Tacoma stood tall. Arik braced himself by the window, and Lyra's trembling eased. Not because danger had faded, but because she knew she wasn't facing it alone. The deep voice outside called out again, louder. "Last chance. Come out, or she pays the price." Tacoma stepped forward, his broad frame blocking the door completely. "If you want us," he shouted back, "then face us with honor." "Leave the woman out of this," a cruel laugh answered him. "Honor doesn't win battles. Fear does." Arik pressed closer to the window, gripping his spear tightly. "They'll try to smoke us out," he murmured, "or force their way in." Lyra's heart clenched. "What do we do?" Tacoma glanced back at her, his gaze steady. "We stand our ground, and we trust each other." The words settled inside her like a steadying hand. She inhaled slowly, drawing strength from the quiet certainty in his voice. Then, through the wall of flames and shadows, a sound echoed across the valley, a distant shout. Then another. The attackers shifted, turning their heads. Tacoma narrowed his eyes. "Someone else is coming," he said. Arik leaned forward. From the east. The shadows outside wavered as figures emerged from the ridge behind the attackers. Lyra strained to see, her pulse racing. Torches bobbed through the darkness, carried by a group approaching fast. Their presence shifted the whole atmosphere. The attackers muttered among themselves, caught off guard. Tacoma exhaled with relief he rarely showed. "It's our own. From our band? They must have tracked us." Within moments, the newcomers surrounded the attackers, weapons drawn, voices sharp but calm. They moved with precision, forcing the hostile group to retreat, step by step. The attackers' leader spat something angry into the dirt. But even he knew they were outnumbered and outmatched. Tacoma pushed open the cabin door, stepping out with bold confidence. Arik followed, though slower due to his injury. Lyra stood in the doorway, watching the two groups face each other in the firelight. The leader of the approaching banda, tall warrior named Kyan, lifted his hand. "Enough," he commanded. "Your fight ends tonight. You attacked two of our own, and now you bring harm to a woman who showed them mercy. This is not the way of our people." The hostile leader glared at him. "They stood against us." Kyan nodded. "Because they wanted peace. Because they refused to let old grudges control the future." Murmurs rippled through both groups. The attackers hesitated, uncertain now, their earlier confidence faltering in the presence of Kyan's authority. The truth of his words settled heavy in the cool night air. Kyan stepped forward. "Leave this valley. There will be no more chasing, no more vengeance. If you choose violence again, it will be met with unity instead of fear." The attackers exchanged tense glances, then one by one backed away. Their leader cast one final scowl at Tacoma and Arik, but even he knew the fight was lost. With torches lowered and pride wounded, they retreated into the darkness beyond the ridge. Slowly, the flames forming the circle died out as Kyan's people stomped them down, clearing the way back to peace. Lyra felt her knees weaken. The danger that had loomed like a storm cloud was finally breaking apart, drifting away with the retreating footsteps. She grabbed the doorframe for balance as Tacoma approached her. "It's over," he said softly. She let out a shaky breath she'd been holding for far too long. "I thought I'd lose everything tonight." "You didn't," Tacoma replied. "Because you stood with us." Arik walked up beside them, leaning slightly on his spear. "And we stood with you." Kyan approached, offering Lyra a kind nod. "Your courage saved these men, and what you did will be remembered." Lyra wasn't used to praise, especially from warriors who carried the weight of their people on their shoulders. She lowered her gaze, humbled. "I only did what anyone with a heart would do." "Not anyone would," Kyan said. "That is why this valley will always welcome you." The group dispersed after extinguishing the last traces of fire. Some stayed a moment longer, offering quiet words of thanks to Lyra, while others checked on Arik's wound. Tacoma spoke with Kyan in low tones, discussing what had happened and what the future would require. Lyra listened, comforted by the sense of unity forming around her little cabin. When the last warriors returned to the ridge, Tacoma and Arik remained, standing with Lyra beneath the open night sky. The stars shone clear and bright above them, as if celebrating the peace that had finally returned. Lyra wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, the cool night breeze brushing against her skin. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Arik answered first. "We go back to our people, but we will return." His voice carried steady reassurance. Tacoma stepped closer. "You are part of our path now. You changed more than you know. You reminded us of the strength and mercy." Lyra felt warmth spread through her chest. "You both protected me, and you stood for peace when it could have cost you your lives. That takes a different kind of courage." Tacoma reached out and gently lifted her hand. His touch was warm and steady, grounding her in a way nothing else could. "You gave us shelter when we had none. You tended wounds that would have taken our lives. You showed trust when the world offers little of it. We won't forget." Arik nodded with quiet sincerity. "You're not alone anymore." For a moment, Lyra couldn't speak. The weight of those words hit deeply. She had spent so long believing solitude was her only protection. She had built walls stronger than stone around her heart, thinking it was the only way to survive. But in one unexpected night, those walls had cracked. And through the cracks, light and hope found their way in again. "You're welcome here," Lyra said softly. "Both of you, always." Tacoma's expression warmed, a rare smile touching his eyes. Eric smiled too, though he tried to hide it. Their presence felt like a promise, one shaped by gratitude and something even deeper. The next morning, the valley looked different. The danger was gone, leaving only the soft glow of dawn stretching across the land. Birds sang again. The wind carried warmth instead of warning. Tacoma and Arik prepared to leave for their camp, though not without lingering. Arik clasped Lyra's hand gently. "Our path leads us home," he said, "but it will lead back to you." Tacoma stepped forward, his eyes steady on hers. "We will return soon. Not because duty calls us, but because we choose to." Hush. Lyra met his gaze, her heart beating with a new, hopeful rhythm. "I'll be here." The brothers walked away together, strong and steady, their figures growing smaller on the ridge. But Lyra didn't feel the ache of loneliness this time. Instead, she felt her home settle into a quiet, peaceful strength. The danger had come and passed. The valley was safe again. She stood on her porch, watching the horizon where the two warriors disappeared. The sun rose behind her, washing her cabin in warm light. Her heart felt full in a way it hadn't for years. She had saved 2 Apache giants in their darkest hour, but they had saved her too in ways she didn't recognize until now. And as the breeze carried the scent of sage through the valley, Lyra smiled, knowing her life had changed for the better. The path ahead was no longer empty. It was filled with promise, with friendship, with new beginnings. And somewhere along that path, 2 warriors would return. Her home. Their bond, a valley no longer silent. A story rewritten by courage, kindness, and a shared wish that had finally found its way into the light.